Picture this. You're 16 years old, and you're a king. But you can't feel the reins of your horse, because your hands are dying. Beneath polished silver gauntlets, your skin is breaking down, nerve ending by nerve ending. You don't feel pain anymore. You don't feel heat. You barely feel anything at all. You're Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. And right now, you're staring out toward the horizon, where a storm of dust is rising into the sky. But that dust isn't weather. It's an army. 26,000 soldiers, led by the most feared conqueror of the age. They're marching to burn your kingdom to the ground. You look around you. You don't have legions. You don't have reinforcements. You have 500 knights. 500 against 26,000. By every law of war, by every cold calculation of logic, you're already dead. Your body is rotting. Your kingdom is outnumbered 50-1. Your advisors are begging you to flee, but you don't. You tighten your grip on a sword you can barely feel, and you order the charge. This is the Battle of Mont Gisard, the single most impossible military victory of the Middle Ages. And it's the story of how a dying boy broke the spine of an empire. But before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, hit that like button, subscribe for more long-form content, and comment below where you're listening from. Because honestly, it's incredible that we're all here together. Different countries, different lives, connected across centuries by the same curiosity. Now, to understand just how insane what happened on November 25th, 1177 really was, we have to strip away the romantic paintings, forget the shining Crusader banners, forget the Hollywood version, because the biological reality of Baldwin IV is horrifying. Baldwin wasn't just a king, he was a walking corpse. Leprosy in the 12th century wasn't just a disease, it was a curse, a mark of divine punishment, a sentence of living death. In most cases, lepers were cast out of society, banished, forced to wear bells so healthy people could hear them coming. They were treated like ghosts, still alive, but already dead in the eyes of the world. But Baldwin was the king of Jerusalem, so he couldn't be cast out, which meant he had to rot on the throne, in full view of everyone. Imagine the psychological toll. Imagine waking up each morning as a child, knowing your body is a countdown. Because Baldwin's tutor, William of Tyre, noticed it first when Baldwin was just 9 years old. He was playing with other boys, roughhousing like any child would, and the other kids dug their fingernails into his arm. Hard enough to make any normal boy scream. But Baldwin didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't even notice. That was the moment the truth became unavoidable. The nerves were dying. And once leprosy begins killing the nerves, you don't feel injuries. You don't feel cuts. You don't feel burns. You don't feel infections spreading underneath the skin until it's too late. And that numbness becomes the most brutal part. Because the body decays quietly. The victim becomes disfigured, blind, crippled, and they can't even feel it happening. By 16, while most young squires were dreaming of glory and romance, Baldwin IV was hiding the fact that his body was disintegrating inside his own armor. He knew with certainty he would never grow old, never marry, never have children. He was the last of his line, a royal dead end. And yet, this decaying teenager was the only thing standing between the Christian world and total annihilation. Because 1177 was a terrifying turning point. The First Crusade was already legend by then, a story grandfathers told their grandsons. The Crusader states, those fragile Christian kingdoms along the coast of the Levant, had survived for decades mostly because their enemies were divided. For years, Muslim powers fought each other more than they fought the Crusaders. Damascus fought Cairo, Aleppo fought Mosul, and the Christians survived in the cracks of that chaos. But that era was over, because a new power had risen, a man who had united Egypt and Syria into a single iron vice, a man with a holy mission. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. To the west, Saladin. And Saladin was everything Baldwin was not. Healthy, vibrant, in the prime of his life. He was a brilliant general and an even better politician. He commanded the resources of a massive empire stretching from the Nile to the Tigris. He had endless money, endless manpower, and one goal that burned like a prophecy: reclaim Jerusalem. From the outside, the matchup looked like a cruel joke: a lion versus a lamb, a force of nature versus a dying child. And in the autumn of 1177, Saladin receives intelligence that makes the decision even easier. Because the kingdom of Jerusalem is vulnerable. The bulk of the Crusader army is gone, distracted up north in Syria, fighting a pointless campaign. Jerusalem is exposed. The gates are unlatched. So Saladin mobilizes, and he doesn't send a raid. He sends the full weight of Egypt, 26,000 men, his elite Mamluk bodyguards, thousands of light cavalry, Sudanese infantry, a massive baggage train. This wasn't meant to win a battle. It was meant to erase a kingdom. And as this tidal wave of steel crosses into Crusader territory, panic spreads like plague. Villages burn. Smoke rises into pale blue sky. Refugees flood the roads, carrying children, carrying what little they can, screaming that the end of the world has arrived. Because no one is coming to stop the invasion. The garrisons are empty, the forts are undermanned, and the only military force available is the king himself, a teenage leper, resting in the south, trying to manage his pain. When the news finally reaches Baldwin, he faces a choice that will define his legacy. His advisors, men who have survived decades of war, look at the numbers. They look at the king's bandaged hands, and they tell him the truth. Retreat. Hole up inside the coastal fortress of Ascalon. Wait for reinforcements. Maybe wait for a miracle. Because riding out with only the royal household guard and a handful of knights against Saladin isn't a battle. It's an execution. But Baldwin IV has something Saladin's spies cannot measure, and his advisors cannot understand. He has the fearlessness of someone already condemned. Because when you've already lost your future, when you can't feel your own skin, when your body is already betraying you, you stop fearing death. Baldwin realizes something simple. If he hides behind the walls of Ascalon, Saladin will bypass him, march straight to Jerusalem, and the holy city will fall while its king cowers in a fortress. That is unacceptable. So Baldwin orders his horse to be saddled. He can't grip the reins anymore, so his grooms tie them around his wrists. He summons every man who can hold a sword. He strips the garrisons of the Knights Templar. He calls every secular knight in range. And when the dust settles, he has barely 500 knights, even counting infantry and sergeants. The numbers are laughable. They are riding out to meet a force 50 times their size. As they march out of Ascalon, the sun beats down on the coastal scrub. Heat presses into chainmail like fire. Inside armor, it's suffocating. Baldwin rides at the front, wrapped in robes and steel to hide what the disease has done to him. And imagine the sight behind him. They aren't following Alexander the Great. They aren't following Charlemagne. They're following a sick teenager who might collapse in the saddle if the pain spikes. But there's something in him, a fire, and it terrifies them more than Saladin ever could. Meanwhile, Saladin makes a mistake. A fatal mistake born from arrogance. He knows Baldwin is at Ascalon. He knows he has a tiny force. So Saladin does what any confident conqueror would do. He ignores him. He leaves only a small detachment to blockade the fortress, just enough to keep the cripple contained. And then he turns north toward Jerusalem. And that's where the rot begins. Because Saladin lets his men disperse. They spread out across the countryside, looting, burning, pillaging. They relax. They think the war is already won. They think God has already handed them the city. They are wrong. Because Baldwin breaks out. He evades the blockade, and instead of running, he chases the giant. He leads 500 knights up the coast, riding hard, pushing horses to exhaustion, chasing the dust cloud of Saladin's army. They are riding into the mouth of the beast. They are riding toward a place called Mont Gisard. And as the sun begins to dip low in the afternoon sky on November 25th, the stage is set. A dying king, a holy relic, 500 knights, and the largest army the region has seen in decades, scattered, unprepared, and about to be blindsided. And here's the part most people don't understand. If Baldwin IV was the dying light of the Christian world, Saladin was the rising sun of the Islamic East. To truly grasp what Baldwin is about to do, we need to understand just how powerful Saladin really was, because he wasn't just a villain in a story. He was a titan. And by 1177, he had the Crusader states in a noose, and Baldwin IV was about to pull that noose tight around his own neck and jump. If Baldwin IV was the dying light of the Christian world, then Saladin was the rising sun of the Islamic East. And to understand why Mont Gisard was so impossible, you can't treat Saladin like some cartoon villain. You have to see him the way his contemporaries saw him, a titan. By 1177, Saladin was 40 years old, prime age for a medieval ruler. Old enough to have experience, young enough to still be dangerous. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a statesman with a genius-level brain and the patience of someone who plays the long game. He achieved what generations of Muslim leaders before him had failed to do. He ended the chaos. For nearly 80 years, the Crusader states survived because the Islamic world was fractured. Damascus fought Cairo. Aleppo fought Mosul. Different dynasties, different ambitions, endless rivalry. And in the cracks between those rivalries, the Christians survived. But Saladin sealed the cracks. First, he seized Egypt, taking the wealth of the Nile. Then he conquered Syria. And suddenly the kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't neighboring squabbling city-states anymore. It was an island, a tiny Christian island in a sea of green. South, Saladin's Egypt. East and north, Saladin's Syria. The noose was tightening. All that remained was to kick away the chair. And the army he brought to do it wasn't just large. It was a masterpiece of logistical terror. 26,000 men. Now in the modern world, we hear numbers like that and shrug. But in the 12th century, in the Levant, where water was life and roads were dust, moving 26,000 men and thousands of horses was like moving a city that ate, a city that drank, a city that destroyed everything in its path. This wasn't a ragtag militia. This was a professional, multinational force funded by the gold of Egypt. And at its core were the Mamluks. And if you don't understand the Mamluks, you don't understand why Mont Gisard should not have happened. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were slave warriors, purchased as boys from the Turkic steppes, converted to Islam, and trained for one purpose: war. They were elite horse archers capable of firing deadly accurate arrows while riding at full gallop. Disciplined, armored, fanatically loyal. Surrounding them were thousands of light cavalry from desert tribes, men who moved like wind and struck like vipers. And behind them marched Sudanese infantry, heavy shock troops known for brutal resilience. Imagine watching this army move across the plain. It would stretch for miles. The sound alone would be overwhelming. The thunder of hooves, clanking armor, shouting men, camels groaning under loads of water and siege equipment. It wasn't an army. It was an extinction event on the march. But Saladin's greatest weapon wasn't his Mamluks. It wasn't his gold. It was his confidence. Because Saladin looked at the reports from his spies and saw a kingdom rotting from the inside. He saw barons arguing over succession. He saw political infighting. And above all, he saw a 16-year-old boy dying on the throne. In the worldview of the time, physical health was often seen as proof of divine favor. A leper king wasn't just tragic. He was a sign. A sign God had abandoned the Franks. Saladin didn't hate Baldwin. If anything, he probably pitied him. He didn't see a rival. He saw a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing yet. And that psychological underestimation is the key to this entire story. Because when Saladin crossed the border near Ascalon, he wasn't preparing for a desperate fight. He was preparing for a victory lap. That arrogance trickled down through the entire army. The moment they realized nobody was coming to stop them, discipline loosened. They bypassed Ascalon. And then Saladin made the fatal decision. He assumed Baldwin was neutralized. He assumed the cripple would stay behind walls, grateful just to survive another day. So Saladin broke one of the oldest rules of warfare. Never leave even a small enemy force behind you. He turned toward Jerusalem. The prize was right there, undefended, waiting. So he gave the order to disperse. The Ayyubid army spread out across the plains of Ramla and Lydda like locusts. They weren't marching in tight formation anymore. They were raiding, stealing cattle, burning crops, looting villages. That iron fist opened into a lazy hand. Smoke rose everywhere, and it drifted south, right toward the walls of Ascalon, taunting the men trapped inside. It was Saladin's way of saying, "I don't even need to fight you. I'll destroy your kingdom around you while you watch." The ultimate insult. But while Saladin was dreaming of his entry into Jerusalem, he failed to look back. Because he didn't understand Baldwin's psychology. He didn't understand that Baldwin lived with pain every day. That pain wasn't a deterrent. It was a companion. And a man with no future has nothing to lose. So while the Egyptian army grew fat and slow on plunder, the gates of Ascalon were quietly opening, and Baldwin IV was mounting up. Not to defend, to hunt. To understand just how insane Baldwin's gamble was, you have to understand how empty the kingdom of Jerusalem truly was in November 1177. It wasn't just that Saladin had a huge army, it's that the Crusaders effectively had none. Weeks earlier, the bulk of the Crusader military strength marched north into Syria, chasing rumors, completely misreading Saladin's strategy. They left the back door wide open, and Saladin walked in, not into a fortress, into an empty house. Baldwin rushed to Ascalon with scraps of manpower. Ascalon was vital, known as the Bride of Syria, a massive coastal fortress, gateway to Egypt. Control Ascalon, and you control the road. But once Baldwin entered, the trap snapped shut. Saladin didn't waste time besieging the city. Sieges were slow and costly. Instead, he left a blocking force, just enough men to surround the gates and keep the Christians pinned down. Then he moved on. Inside Ascalon, the situation was claustrophobic. 500 knights, a few thousand infantry, packed into narrow streets, heat building, morale collapsing. And these men weren't stupid. They could climb the ramparts. They could see the Muslim screen outside arrow range. But worse, they could see past them, and in the distance across the plains, columns of black smoke, village after village, farm after farm, burning. Every plume of smoke meant death. Every hour meant another town erased. And the men inside Ascalon weren't abstract soldiers. They were locals. That smoke was their homes, their families, and they were trapped behind stone walls, forced to watch while their king, half dead, could do nothing. The tension must have been suffocating. The sensible move was to stay. Ascalon was nearly impregnable. They had food, they had water. They could wait until the northern army returned. Jerusalem might fall in the meantime, but the state would survive. The king would survive. But Baldwin IV wasn't operating on the frequency of sane men. Remember, this is a 16-year-old boy who has been told his entire life that he is cursed, that his disease is divine punishment. Yet he believes he is an anointed king. He has a desperate need to prove something, to prove that even if his flesh is rotting, his soul is worthy of the crown. He cannot sit behind walls while his people are slaughtered. He cannot let Saladin walk into Jerusalem unopposed. There's a specific kind of courage that comes when you have an expiration date. Baldwin looked at his bandaged hands, then at his terrified commanders. He knew leaving the walls meant almost certain death. 500 knights versus 26,000 on open ground? That's not a battle. It's a feeding frenzy. But Baldwin saw something Saladin missed. The force outside Ascalon wasn't enough. Saladin, so sure the Leper King was helpless, left only a screen, not a wall. So on the morning of November 25th, Baldwin made the call. Not defense, breakout. The gates of Ascalon swung open. The Muslim blocking force, expecting the Christians to cower, was caught off guard. And the Crusaders didn't creep out. They erupted. They smashed through the thin line of besiegers, cutting them down before they could organize. And suddenly, they were free. But the breakout was the easy part, because the moment they left the walls, they were alone. No reinforcements, no supply line, just a small column of steel and flesh riding north along the coast. To the right, the burning interior of the kingdom. To the left, the endless blue Mediterranean, and ahead of them, the rear of Saladin's colossal army. This is where the kingdom of sand becomes real. They aren't fighting for territory anymore. They're fighting for existence. Baldwin pushed the pace. He knew he couldn't outmuscle Saladin, but maybe he could catch him off guard. So they rode hard toward Ramla, toward the heart of the invasion. They were gambling everything on surprise. Because surely, Saladin could not conceive of a dying boy hunting a lion. And the knights followed him for one reason. They weren't just carrying swords. They were carrying God. Riding alongside Baldwin was the Bishop of Bethlehem, and in his hands was the true cross. To a modern mind, it's a piece of wood and gold. To a 12th century knight, this was the nuclear option of spiritual warfare. They believed it was the actual timber on which Jesus died. Its presence meant God wasn't watching from heaven. God was riding at the front. A suicide mission became a holy pilgrimage. If they died protecting it, salvation was guaranteed. It suppressed fear the way adrenaline suppresses pain. But Baldwin had no relic to numb his suffering. He had only his disintegrating body. Let's zoom in inside his armor. Riding a war horse is physical. Core strength, balance, constant control of reins. For a healthy man, a forced march under desert sun is brutal. For Baldwin, it's torture. His hands and feet are numb, and that numbness is a curse. You don't feel the reins slipping until they're gone. You don't feel the stirrups. Your balance collapses. So Baldwin compensates with his whole body, locking his thighs against the saddle until his muscles scream. The heat inside chainmail is unbearable. Bandages become soaked, chafing against open lesions. Friction causes bleeding he can't even feel. He is literally bleeding into his boots, riding through heatstroke, exhaustion, and agony. Held together by nothing but terrifying willpower. Supporting him was the backbone of steel, the Knights Templar. And here we meet Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master. If Baldwin was the spirit of the army, Odo was its fist. The Templars were the special forces of the Crusades, warrior monks who swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. Here, they're outnumbered 50-1. And Odo doesn't flinch. He rallies his 80 Templar knights around the king and the cross, an elite vanguard, a moving fortress. Together, this strange coalition, a dying boy, a fanatic monk, and a holy relic, rides north like ghost riders. And Saladin has no idea. His scouts lose them. The Sultan, still dreaming of Jerusalem, is marching in slow confidence, while the cripple he left behind closes distance at a gallop. The geography funnels them toward each other. Saladin's massive army is crossing a wadi, a dry riverbed near the hill of Mont Gisard, Tel el-Jiza, and his army is struggling under its own weight. The baggage train is slow. The stolen herds clog roads. The soldiers are tired from days of looting. They're disorganized. They're essentially a traffic jam, armed with swords. As Baldwin's force approaches Mont Gisard, the sun begins to cast long shadows. The wind is blowing from the north, carrying Saladin's dust into the faces of the Crusaders. They can taste the enemy before they see him. Then the scouts return to Baldwin, breathless. Not a patrol, not a rear guard. The entire host, just ahead, crossing the wadi, armor packed away in wagons because of heat, horses unmounted, men resting, unprepared. Baldwin stops. He looks at his 500 knights, dust-caked, horses foaming, and ahead, an ocean of enemies. This is the moment. No council of war, no time for tactics, only shock. Baldwin dismounts, his limbs stiff, unresponsive. He falls to his knees in the sand, before the true cross. The entire army goes silent, only wind, only distant enemy murmurs, and Baldwin prays out loud, his voice cracking with pain and emotion. He weeps, and when the knights see their king, a boy who should be in a sickbed, crying into the dirt and begging God for victory, they begin to weep too. Not despair, release, acceptance. Then Baldwin rises. The tears are gone, and without a single speech, he signals, "Strike. Now." Let's shift the camera to the other side of the hill. You're a soldier in Saladin's army. You're relaxed, you're confident. You've spent days burning villages. Your saddlebags are heavy with loot. The Franks are finished. Their king is trapped in Ascalon. Their army is lost in the north. The war is basically over. Saladin's army is moving across rolling plains. But because of confidence, discipline has evaporated. The army is stretched out for miles. The baggage train clogs roads. Camels carry tents, water, stolen goods. Men dismount to rest at the stream. Some remove armor to escape the heat. Saladin himself is likely discussing the final approach to Jerusalem. Then, the ground trembles. At first, maybe you think it's an earthquake, but the vibration becomes rhythmic. A low thrumming rises from the south. Veterans recognize it instantly, but their brains reject it. Because it's impossible. It's the sound of a heavy cavalry charge, but no army is behind them. And then they see it. Out of heat haze and dust, banners, white fields with gold crosses, the black and white standard of the Templars, and in the center, shimmering like a mirage, the cross. Panic spreads faster than fire. The rear soldiers scream warnings, but it's too late. They can't form a line. They're caught in column, long snake formation, vulnerable on the flanks. And Baldwin doesn't hesitate. No parley, no terms. He unleashes the charge. Because now we reach the part where history turns into physics. A Frankish knight in the 12th century was a kinetic missile. Knight, horse, armor, over 1,000 pounds of momentum. They rode with heavy ash lances couched under the arm. When they hit, it isn't arm strength. It's the full force of a galloping warhorse concentrated into a steel tip the size of a coin. 500 missiles, all at once. They slam into Saladin's disorganized flank like a sledgehammer through glass. The sound would be sickening. Lances cracking, bone crunching, horses screaming. Light cavalry, unarmored, unmounted, are vaporized on impact. The Crusader wedge drives deep, carving a path of red ruin and leading the charge, a miracle inside armor. Baldwin IV, the king with dead hands, riding at the tip of the spear, strapped in, guided by squires, but present, bleeding, fighting, and his presence electrifies his men. They aren't fighting for a distant monarch. They're fighting for the boy dying beside them, and they fight with a ferocity Muslim chroniclers later described as demonic. Odo de Saint-Amand and his Templars act like a chainsaw, disciplined, tight formation, cutting through everything, and their target is clear. They aren't hunting foot soldiers. They aren't hunting loot. They're hunting the yellow banners of Saladin's personal guard. They're headhunting. Saladin, near the center, watches in horror as his flank collapses. He scrambles his Mamluks. These are his best warriors. They mount and form a desperate defensive ring around him. But momentum belongs to the Crusaders, and then geography turns on Saladin. The baggage train, once comfort, becomes a trap. Carts and camels block retreat. The Wadi crossing becomes a bottleneck of crushed bodies. This isn't magic. It's tactical surprise, terrain, and shock warfare applied with terrifying clarity. The Crusaders know they have one chance. If they stop, if they bog down in melee, numbers swallow them whole. So they keep moving, keep charging, cutting deeper toward command. And for Saladin, the world flips in 20 minutes. The hunter becomes prey. He sees the white mantles of the Templars breaking toward him. He sees the Leper King, face hidden behind bandages, coming straight for his throat. The man who wanted Jerusalem is now fighting just to survive the next 10 seconds. And that's where part 2 ends. Because what happens next is where the victory becomes total. The hammer blow has landed. Now comes the slaughter. The initial impact was the hammer blow. But battles aren't won by the first strike alone. They're won in the bloody, chaotic grinding that follows, when fear turns into collapse, and collapse turns into slaughter. And as the dust settled over the valley near Tel El Giza, The true scale of what was happening became visible. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a prison riot. The mist of Mont Gisard wasn't poetic. It was real. A blinding cocktail of sand, sweat, and blood that swallowed the entire battlefield. Inside that cloud, Saladin's numerical advantage meant nothing, because an army of 26,000 men that cannot maneuver isn't an army. It's a traffic jam. And the Crusaders, outnumbered, exhausted, but mounted on heavy war horses, moved like wolves in a sheep pen. They were faster, heavier, and they had one brutal advantage. They were fighting like men who believed they were already dead. But there was one group that didn't panic. One group that didn't break. The Mamluk Imperial Guard. These weren't conscripts. They were trained from childhood to die for the Sultan. And while peasants and light cavalry scattered into twilight, the Mamluks held. They formed a yellow wall of steel around Saladin's position. This became the hardest fighting of the day. The Templars, led by Odo de Saint-Amand, smashed into that wall again and again. It was heavy cavalry against heavy cavalry now. A grinding contest of strength where lances became useless and swords did the work. And in the center of this maelstrom, somehow, was Baldwin IV. And this is where the story stops being just military history and becomes something else. Because by every medical law, Baldwin should have collapsed from heat stroke within 10 minutes. His body was already compromised, his skin fragile, his nerves dead, and yet chroniclers claim he fought in the thick of it. Imagine the micro view again. The king strapped into his saddle like a corpse propped upright, arrows pinging off armor, steel screaming, horses crashing, the smell thick and nauseating, iron, sweat, fear, and the unmistakable stench of death. And Baldwin doesn't fall. His presence becomes a totem. Every time a Crusader looks up and sees the golden helmet still upright, still moving forward, they find a fresh reserve of strength, because if the dying boy can fight, they have no excuse to tire, and the Crusaders get close, terrifyingly close. They nearly capture Saladin's baggage train. They seize personal belongings meant for a victorious march into Jerusalem. For Saladin, the psychological shock is complete. He watches his nephew, Taqi al-Din, fighting desperately to buy time. He watches close relatives cut down in front of him. The myth of Ayyubid invincibility is being dismantled by a cripple. And when the Mamluk line finally breaks, it isn't a tactical retreat. It's a collapse. The Mamluks realize the Sultan is seconds away from capture or death, so they do the ultimate sacrifice. They throw themselves onto Templar horses, dying in droves, just to create a gap for Saladin to escape. And escape he does, but not as a conqueror. The great Saladin, the Eagle of Egypt, the man history would later call chivalrous and unstoppable, flees like a thief. In the chaos, he loses his warhorse and is forced onto a racing camel, light, fast, built for speed, not war. Visualize that. The most powerful man in the Middle East, whipping a camel through the darkening desert, leaving his army behind to be butchered. He doesn't stop, doesn't rally, doesn't regroup. He runs, with only a handful of guards, and the moment the Sultan disappears, the remaining soldiers lose the will to fight. Because in ancient warfare, once morale breaks, the battle is over, and the rout is where the real killing happens. The Crusaders chase them, 12 miles, until night swallows the plain. And when the sun finally goes down, the landscape is unrecognizable. The invincible Egyptian army is scattered to the wind. Its baggage train, Wealth meant to rebuild Jerusalem as an Islamic capital is now in Crusader hands. Baldwin halts his horse. He is likely barely conscious, his bandages soaked, his body on the edge of collapse. But he's done the impossible. 500 men charged into death and broke the teeth of the beast, and yet, the war isn't over. Because Mont Gisard doesn't end when swords are sheathed. In many ways, the real slaughter begins after the battle. As the adrenaline fades, the skies change, and fate delivers one more twist. Because that night, the weather turns. Christian chroniclers later call it divine intervention. The skies open, a brutal winter storm descends. Freezing rain, biting wind, the kind of cold that cuts through bone. And remember, Saladin's army is fleeing in panic. Most have thrown away armor to run faster. They're dehydrated, starving, lost, and now they are trying to crawl back to Egypt, across one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, the Sinai Peninsula. As rain turns dust into freezing mud, Saladin's retreat becomes a death march. For 10 days, the survivors stagger south, and the desert, like it always does, finishes the job. Bedouin tribes smell blood. They had once been paid off or intimidated by Saladin. Now they see the Sultan broken, vulnerable. They emerge from the dunes to harass stragglers, strip the dead, rob the dying. Men are left naked in freezing rain. Saladin himself is reduced to a fugitive fighting the elements. No royal tent, no servants, no hot meals. He drinks muddy water from puddles. He watches companions die of exposure. And it's said he barely spoke during the retreat. So exhausted, so fearful of capture, he became a shadow of the conqueror who entered Palestine days earlier. The numbers are staggering. Out of 26,000 men who marched confidently into Crusader lands, historical estimates suggest barely 10% made it back. Think about that. Over 20,000 men didn't die in combat. They died in the chaos of defeat. They died of thirst, hypothermia. They died alone, buried in the shifting sands of Sinai. Back in Cairo, news of the disaster arrives before Saladin does. The city mourns. Rumors spread that the Sultan is dead, and when he finally returns, haggard, ghost-like, he is a changed man. He's lost his army, his wealth, his aura of invincibility. He later writes to his brother admitting, "We have fallen into a distress that only God can relieve." A confession of total defeat. And while Saladin is enduring his walk of shame, Jerusalem erupts in delirious joy. Baldwin returns to the holy city not as a leper, but as a savior. He has achieved what great kings of Europe will later fail to do. He has destroyed the main field army of the Islamic world with a handful of knights. The bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre ring. People flood the streets, trying to touch the hem of his robes. They don't see bandages. They see victory. They don't see rotting flesh. They see God's hand. But now, zoom in. Because the adrenaline dump after battle is brutal even for healthy men. For Baldwin, it's catastrophic. He pushed his body beyond its limits. When the armor is peeled away in private, the reality is grim. The exertion accelerated the disease. Lesions worse. Numbness spreading. He bought his kingdom time, but he paid for it with his life force. That's the tragic irony of Mont Gisard. It was the high watermark of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, and the beginning of the end for its greatest hero. The victory sent shockwaves across Europe, in Paris, London, Rome. The story of the Leper King's miracle spreads like wildfire. It gives the West a false sense of security. They believe God is protecting Jerusalem. They believe the kingdom is safe. They don't realize the kingdom is being held together by the willpower of one dying teenager. And Saladin? Saladin doesn't forget. He returns to Egypt humiliated, but not broken. He rebuilds, retrains, and swears he will never underestimate Baldwin again. The storm has passed, but the shadow of the future is already creeping toward Jerusalem's walls, because miracles are rarely repeatable. In the years after 1177, Baldwin's body begins to shut down. By his early 20s, he is blind, the nerves in his eyes destroyed. Hands and feet become useless stumps. He can no longer mount a horse, can no longer hold a sword. The famous golden mask depicted in pop culture isn't vanity, it's concealment, a face collapsing inward. And yet, he continues to rule, he continues to lead. Saladin, traumatized by Mont Gisard, changes strategy. He stops trying to crush the Crusaders in one decisive battle. Instead, he becomes the vulture. He waits for the lion to die. He probes borders, tests resolve, rebuilds discipline. But even a dying lion can bite. In 1183, Saladin besieges the castle of Kerak. The Crusaders mobilize to lift the siege, and Baldwin cannot ride. So what does he do? He orders servants to carry him on a litter, a stretcher slung between horses. Imagine it. The King of Jerusalem, blind, crippled, unable to stand, being carried into a war zone like a holy relic. And the most incredible part? It works. When Saladin hears Baldwin is present, even lying on a stretcher, he withdraws. He retreats. Because Saladin fears the spirit of Baldwin more than the body. But Baldwin cannot hold back the enemies within his own court. And this is where the story turns into political tragedy. As Baldwin weakens, vultures circle inside Jerusalem. Ambitious men don't pity him. They resent him. They want him gone. Men like Guy of Lusignan, Reynald of Châtillon, reckless, arrogant, hungry for power. Men who break truces, raid caravans, provoke Saladin just for gold. Ignoring the fragile balance Baldwin sacrificed his life to maintain. Baldwin tries to control them. He tries to manage succession, appoint capable regents, but his body fails. He is losing his grip on the reins of state, just as he lost his grip on his horse's reins. The tragedy of Mont Gisard is that it bought the kingdom time, and the kingdom wasted it. Instead of strengthening, the barons squabble over who gets the crown next. They don't realize the crown they're fighting for is about to become a crown of thorns. In 1185, at just 24 years old, Baldwin IV dies. The Leper King is gone. The Iron Wall collapses. When Saladin hears the news, he doesn't celebrate. No dancing, no cheers. Reports say he sits in solemn silence, because he respected Baldwin more than any healthy knight now scrambling for the throne. He knows with Baldwin gone, the soul of the kingdom has departed. Now the game is fair, and in a fair fight, Saladin knows he won't lose again. The miracle of 1177 is over. The nightmare of 1187 is coming. 2 years. That's how long the kingdom of Jerusalem survives without Baldwin. The crown passes to men with healthy bodies and decaying minds. Guy of Lusignan becomes king, a handsome, empty noble who looks like a ruler but thinks like a novice. Beside him, Reynald of Châtillon, brutal, reckless, treating treaties like toilet paper. Together, they undo in 24 months what Baldwin preserved for a decade. In July 1187, Saladin returns. But this time, he isn't facing a strategic genius. He's facing fools. He lays bait at Tiberias, a trap meant to lure the Crusader army away from water and fortifications across the arid plateau of Galilee during summer. It's the same setup as Mont Gisard. but with one crucial difference: leadership. Baldwin moved like lightning. Guy moves like sludge. He marches the entire strength of the kingdom, larger than Baldwin's force, into a waterless wasteland. The Battle of Hattin becomes the anti-Mont Gisard, a masterclass in how not to fight Saladin. The Crusaders are surrounded. Smoke from brush fires chokes them. They die of thirst before swords even clash. When the end comes, it's total. Guy is captured. Reynald is executed by Saladin himself. Templars and Hospitallers are rounded up and beheaded en masse. But the greatest loss isn't the men. It's the symbol. Remember the true cross, the relic that emboldened 500 knights at Mont Gisard. At Hattin, it is captured, and Saladin parades it upside down through Damascus. For the Christian world, this is heavier than any city falling. It's as if God himself has been taken prisoner. Weeks later, Saladin arrives at Jerusalem's gates. There is no Baldwin on the walls. No miracle coming. The city surrenders on October 2nd, 1187. Saladin enters not as a butcher, but as a magnanimous victor. He allows those who pay ransom to leave, purifies Al-Aqsa with rose water. He becomes, in the eyes of history, the chivalrous sultan. And as refugees stream out of Jerusalem, the memory of Mont Gisard must feel like a fever dream. How did they fall so far so fast? They forgot Baldwin's lesson. Survival in the East required more than armor and walls. It required unity, speed, clarity of purpose. Without Baldwin, the Crusaders become just another foreign army in hostile land, heavy, slow, and blind. Mont Gisard fades into history, an inconvenient footnote. Why? Because history is written by victors, and ultimately, the Crusaders lose. It's painful to remember a miracle when you know the ending is tragedy. It's easier to remember Richard the Lionheart than to remember the disfigured boy who actually beat Saladin. But Saladin never forgot. Until his dying day, the only Christian leader he truly feared was not Guy of Lusignan, not Richard. It was the boy who had to be tied to his horse. So why are we returning to this story now? Why has Baldwin IV exploded on social media, TikTok, YouTube, everywhere? It isn't just because medieval battles look cool. It's because Baldwin represents the answer to a question every human eventually faces. What do you do when life treats you unfairly? We live in an era obsessed with appearance, health, curating the perfect image. Baldwin lost all of that before puberty. He was dealt one of the worst hands imaginable: a rotting body, a short life, an enemy 20 times his size. By every logical metric, he should have been a victim. He should have hidden, complained, waited for the inevitable, but he didn't. He put on a mask, strapped himself to a horse, and rode out to meet the impossible. Mont Gisard isn't just a military victory. It's a philosophical statement. It proves spirit can command the body even as the body collapses. It proves numbers don't matter against absolute conviction. Baldwin didn't defeat Saladin with better weapons or more men. He defeated him because he accepted death, and in doing so, became unstoppable. Saladin may have retaken Jerusalem later. He may have won the geopolitical war. But Baldwin won something else. He forced the greatest conqueror of his age to bow his head in respect to a dying boy. And when we look at 500 knights charging into 26,000, we're not just watching medieval history, we're watching a metaphor. Because we all have our own Mont Gisard. Maybe it's illness, maybe it's a financial crisis, maybe it's a dream everyone tells you is impossible. You look at the horizon and you see 26,000 reasons to give up. You see the dust rising, You feel fear, and Baldwin's legacy whispers a brutal truth across 8 centuries. Saddle up anyway. The walls may fall, the body may fail, the kingdom may crumble. But for one glorious afternoon in the desert, if you refuse to bow to the inevitable, you can make even giants run in fear. If you found value in this story, subscribe to the channel. We're building a library of history's most unbelievable forgotten moments, and I want you to be part of it. And here's my question for you in the comments. What is the Mont Gisard in your life right now? What is the impossible battle you're fighting? Share your story. You might find you're not fighting alone. And if you want to understand the man who finally defeated the Crusaders, click this video here to learn about the true genius of Saladin. Or if you want to go deeper into the warriors who rode beside Baldwin, click here for the dark history of the Knights Templar. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about who we are today.